Hello everyone, today we talk about the post-Genghis Khan period, namely the continuation of the Mongol conquests with a bias for the invasion of Europe. That is an underestimated chapter, let's say, in European history. Let's say that the Mongol conquests have logically brought to much greater historiographical interest because there were actual conquests, right? But for example, the anti-Mongol Crusade, and at least the mark that this life was never to be, and that's part of the reason why it's been kind of overlooked. But still, the mark that this left, the triggering of some factors that are interesting in a European perspective, have been maybe passed by just because eventually, of course, the conquest didn't happen, and this opens for a military history channel like these to an interesting series of considerations relatively to the Mongol strategic goals, why they invaded Europe, what was their idea of it, what were they searching for, and why eventually, not just the thing didn't quite happen, at least also as a permanent conquest of those areas that had been, also heavily damaged, and as you know, Russia, Poland, etc. But also what, this sense, the idea of the Mongol, because we don't have sources fundamentally on any of this. We don't have sources about Mongol planning. We don't know what they thought of Europe themselves in that regard, why they apparently gave up the invasion, why this was never reattempted again. Naturally, this is a rhetorical question because there might have been other factors, mainly the same political ones that brought them, first of all, to go back to Mongolia because the great Khan had died, but also in later ones that might have not properly triggered the possibility of launching another invasion, large-scale invasion of Europe. And in this regard, it's always, of course, a political issue, and as before even than a strategical one. And so we don't know enough even to make certain considerations positively. And yet you find here and there people saying, it was because of this reason, because there was rain that year, and the Mongol bowstrings were not good. Because as if the Mongols, by the way, never fought in a humid weather, or heavy, say, humid terrain would have not dramatically disfavored Western heavy cavalry, as opposed to actually the Mongol one who was best suited for that. In any case, that's not the issue, right? It doesn't seem like a cogent explanation, nor in fact it shifts the balance on aspects that there are. Even climate is important. Of course, there is a sort of tolerance of adaptation capacity, especially in military history, and for an army like the Mongol one, that is probably, together with the Roman one, the most adaptive, right? To even for the Mongols, even more possibly from a climatological point of view, there is a kind of a breaking point. These factors do influence the thing, but they're never decisive. They never even come remotely close to a 50% plus one of the reality. So there are just lots of factors floating, and so it's always many, but at least of the ones that are kind of more contingental, then there are the most solid ones in that at the base of these communities and their culture and so on, that are also another thing. So one can't really make a point in that regard, and it would be heartwarming and very emotional to have actually a Mongol source of the time stating things like that. I don't know, we don't want to invade Europe because there are too many castles, or there are too few pastures, or I don't know, here the food is not good, right? Or things like this, because really, one should understand even a broader perspective of how these armies moved and how they operated. Even all this circling around. Notoriously, Mongol armies were so large that if they take a route of invasion, they couldn't quite withdraw from it along the same, because they would simply lay waste to anything they found, like literally the grass for feeding the horse, aside from the active destruction, right? So also what happened in Europe is quite exemplificative of this, and doesn't quite speak much of a in outline, in appearance of a of a strategy aimed at permanent occupation, right? It's not just about the fact that they were just kind of exploring the area that they didn't know, of course, at least directly. It's just that you don't destroy, or you turn into pasture what is something you want to rule, right? You don't kill the cow that you want to milk, right? So if Europe was obviously a largely agricultural sedentary reality, if you want to dominate on it, you don't just kind of raise everything to the ground. There were, arguably some advantages in theory to dominate Europe, but again, strategies measured in how the hell do you do it, and eventually also how do you politically keep the thing under control. In spite of lack of that, we mostly rely on chronicles, right? There are some documents that show, and there are even some missives to Innocent IV from the Great Khan, says asking for submission and all these things. But from the intelligence of the time, the info that we gather about historically is that the main goal, at least according to the Europeans, of the Mongols would have been the Holy Roman Empire. It's kind of obvious also if you consider that in fact it had taken over Russia, that had laid waste Poland and Hungary. They had in fact arrived within the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. They had essentially entered Saxony, Bohemia. They arrived up to Croatia. Some raiding parties crossed the Alps. So this is quite interesting because it does show, of course, this dramatic projection capability that the Mongols had shown in environments that were also relatively more permeable in a way, whereas Europe, this is my personal opinion, was too much of a tough nut to crack, right? At least the Mongol army was essentially developed for any kind of situation. They engage in sieges and so on, but let's say the problem posed by Europe mostly would have been that they would have had to stop at every single stinky castle they would have found, right? And Europe was literally disseminated with it every few kilometers, so it would have been dramatic to say the least, to stop every tens of kilometers to fundamentally besiege a place that didn't even have this dramatic strategic relevance, if not in fact in the idea of taking over this whole system that would have been just doing this one after the other. So we're talking about 13th century Europe. It had dramatic resources. We know that we'll see now that Frederick II armed the Crusade, or at least was at the time he was excommunicated. There were some negotiations with the papacy because everybody was freaking out, right? Literally, these guys were coming out of nowhere, that they were arriving at the gates of Germany, and that nobody knew what the hell to do. Frederick wrote to the King of England, one of France. The Pope called the Crusade from Norway to Sicily. It was a serious thing, and that's why it's underappreciated. And anti-Mongol crusades were actually called as late up to the mid 14th century, although none of them was actually even working. That the same Christians at some point hoped they could even bring the Mongols to their side in in an anti-Islamic strategy, but as most of these things, they remained ideal, and a bit of this distance, after all, is the one that measures also the why things didn't actually happen, right? And as we were saying also in the last video we made on Genghis Khan about the first invasion of Russia, the second one after him brought to, in the 40s, brought to the late 30s, beginning of the 40s, brought to properly the destruction of Russia, right? And the main centers, and completely remolded the country in ways that, as we've seen, were quite foundational also in much of what is Russian policy and culture in essence, even up to our days. But of course, Western Europe didn't quite witness the same things. Poland, yes, was invaded twice, kind of remained kind of open to the possibility of invasions. Hungary too, right? Having this just the step across the Carpathians, they suffered it heavily, right? Both the German Poles were defeated at Legnica, the Hungarians at Mohi. The countries recovered relatively well, right? The destructions in Poland were very heavy. Also, so the ones in Hungary were, but Hungary at least recovered in a much in a better style, comparatively. This is maybe debatable, but there is substantial evidence to support this. And so, yes, the Mongols remained eventually with the Golden Horde at the boundaries of Europe, up to Crimea, to the Don, right? So they were just behind the corner in many ways, and it's more as a territorial domination. And when one takes into account the raids they were capable of mounting up, you realize that they had a still further reach of mostly what we consider as Slavic Europe, broadly meant, was always kind of under the threat of these populations. This is interesting because also the reason why, for example, the Slavs or the Yugoslav had kind of settled in the areas they had done was in historically speaking also in function of the steppe in a way. It was in this mechanism of people's movements and kind of domino effects. Say the Germans descended mostly towards the southwest. Eventually they chose the most advanced areas. The Slavs eventually appeared later, kind of expanded further, at least in some of the gaps that the Germans had left open up to the Elbe. That's quite evident, and kind of stop at the steppe, right? That was, for that matter, just another environment where the sedentary Slavs wouldn't. I mean, they would also penetrate in a way, but not in a consistent way compared to the Turkic Mongol peoples that eventually kept dwelling in there. And so there was always this inherent attrition in the area. And so the certain parts of Central Europe, also of the Balkans, were much more, would consider like the presence of the next nomadic people, coming to invade your land, quite of a distinct possibility for centuries to come. Also considering that eventually with the Ottomans later on, much of these movements from the now Islamicized Khanates were of East, like around the Black Sea, and so I was thinking about the Crimean one, the Golden Horde, etc., were re-injecting this steppe element in up to even Central Europe. That most of, at least many of the ethnic, say of some light and medium cavalry types of modern European armies are actually very much styled out of models that were quite close to the ones of the steppes. Think about the Hussars, the Uhlans, right? Aside from independently from the all the mechanism which the name changed, the type even of cavalry changed, and etc. But there is all this part of, say, the eastern half of Europe that kind of was still reflective of the importance of light cavalry and essentially of these tactics and strategies of the steppe that were, if anything, what they had to cope with, even if not properly in some areas, weren't still a reality, like in the Hungarian Puszta and in some areas of of Poland or etc. In any case, at the death of Genghis Khan, as at the one of any other great Khan, the Mongolian chieftains were due to reunite at the Qara-Khitai at Karakorum, right in the heart of the old Mongolia, to choose within their imperial family, the imperial family that, as we've seen, constituted this kind of divinely sanctioned dynasty, in fact, the new sovereign. This was quite important also in organizational terms, because as we've seen, the ulus, the house, the possession, the asset of the imperial family, like the one of all the others, was fundamentally fundamentally differed in this from the others, because every newly conquered land outside of Mongolia kind of belonged to them privately. So even all the hierarchical promotion meritocratic mechanism system was based on Wu. Naturally had the legitimacy and the power of sorting this out would allow the various clans to partake, to share the administration, to control the settlement in some areas. So it was a radical problem that had to be settled just in this traditional reality that, as we've seen, has had a great impact in defining eventually the same Mongol legacy, because they kind of kept working separately from the more civilized lands at the end of the day the Mongols had conquered. We'll see it better later for about the Yuan dynasty, for example, in China. So Genghis Khan was succeeded by his son Ögödei, and immediately the Mongols resumed their conquest program. Right, the big wave was not ended; it was actually yet to come in this sense. So, while the great Khan Ögödei completed the subjugation of China, at least the northern part, and of Persia, Genghis Khan's grandson Batu headed towards Europe. So as we've seen also in the other videos, the area between the Urals, the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, had already known the fury of the Kingizid hordes, right? As in 1222, on the Khalkha River, the Confederate Russian dukes had been bent to it, and the Mongols had fundamentally, come to score to defeat all the enemies that had found gravitating around the Caspian Sea, and all these opposition had been crushed. So already, it was already clear that the area was unstable enough. Let's say that the Kievan Rus, in all its greatness during the previous centuries, had somewhat given some signs of political instability in the balance between the principalities and the mercantile communities. So even in there, right, there is always this almost idea of not an exotic, bias, but like the idea that whatever was more Eastern and kind of developed was the most special thing ever, right? Surely Russia would have been much better off without the Mongol invasions. But at the same time, there were some features of that system that were showing signs, by the 13th century, signs of important instability. And so the Mongols had grasped that, and they took the opportunity of properly crushing the system and to subjugate it better at a distance, because evidently they didn't want themselves even to literally set their foot there on a stable in a stable fashion, and they would mostly maintain Russia as a vassal, as you know, later on. And in fact, in 1238, Batu, with the same ferocity that the Mongols had displayed 20 years before, but a much clearer program of conquest, headed towards the west. And 2 years later, in 1240, Kiev, the greatest, most powerful and splendid of the Rus cities, fell under its blows. And the Russian collapse at this point is, was probably one of the single most radically traumatic events in the history of Europe. The fact that what the Russian and Western European relations have been throughout the last centuries, and I mean, you can argue up to that point back in time, haven't quite, let's say, have drawn a divide, right? And say, okay, well, that happened in Russia, we kind of cares. We mostly care about what happened in Britain or France, right? That's mostly as a Western perspective. The point is that we have eliminated in this regard the realization that pre-Mongol Russia was a much more similar thing than, say, to Central Europe than it would become later, right? And this system literally collapsed in a way that, say, the Russians had already associated with the Mongol, arrival to some biblical apocalyptic event that Kiev was properly the sacred city, in a way, that the Patriarchy of Russia was eventually shifted exactly because of this from Kiev to Vladimir before the Muscovites eventually seized on their own later on, under, by the way, ironically being exactly the most perfect of the Tartar creations in Russia. And the event was traumatic because it literally wiped out all the political and social balance that had been established in Russia at the time. Russia was quite diverse. It had maintained this kind of unity in the form of a dynastic principle standing behind the idea of the Rurikid dynasty. So the fact that all the Russian princes more or less allegedly descended from this old Varangian leader. That it's possible we lack some chains there, but it's not much important in itself from a biological point of view. We lack one ring in a chain sometimes, but it's there's things lost in the myth, and that there is today so much radically violent and phobically paranoid ethno-nationalism, especially in countries like those, to fix any kind of connection with anything that is outside of what Eastern Europe fundamentally is about. That becomes the most important thing. What actually the reality actually was an extremely diverse and distant and quite difficultly unified. Of course, it was never unified, but it's a unifiable system that stretched literally from the Baltic to the Black Sea, right? From the Carpathians to in fact almost to the Volga, right? So it was something that you can easily understand, but between the 11th to 13th century couldn't have any cohesion of any sort, especially on the grounds of what even the Slavic migrations had historically been in these areas. They had been very, let's say, there had never been that had occurred before, but then there had not been like major confederal monarchic movements that eventually established clear compact realities in an already civilized world, like was the case, for example, for the Germans in Western Europe. These areas were, for example, first of all, extremely wild in many ways, and there wasn't even here quite a frontier of any sort, right? Yes, there was a divide, also climatologically, speaking between the areas of the forest, the one of the steppe. There are important differences in the garden. That was the main divide, also ethnically, between the Slavs and the Turks before the Mongol arrival. But even in there, as the Russians said, our own pagans, were settled as mercenaries, was an extremely complex system. And the system had flourished in the measure, in part, probably exactly because it was so divided in some ways. There was no autocratic rule. There were these main trade centers fundamentally on the great Russian rivers that had developed, by the way, as such. Without no city had ever existed there in the first place. So these were essentially town hills over rivers, and that had kind of developed this political and strategical capacity control, where an aristocratic princely leadership had always struggled to rule against the middle classes that had developed quite consistently, that derived from these Slavic, let's say, very poorly stratified societies that were it had been a big deal for the same leaders to emerge in the first place, because the middle class would kind of keep them down. So you can surely see even in pre-Mongol Russia some kind of, princely imitation of the Turkic or the steppe models that were dramatically more autocratic and imperialistic, and in this sense, very much in contrast with the idea of a local autonomy of the people and so on. But of course, Russia had developed this, balance, this dichotomy, and this arguably had favored, in fact, its own prosperity in a way. But this system also probably didn't evolve into something more advanced either, right? The Russian cities were not like, I don't know, the Italian city-states, or like a system that seemingly developed. At least, some cities went on, as you understand, especially Novgorod, that maintained, in fact, this kind of more republican phase, also because it didn't fall but until the 15th century to the Muscovites, and it represented the opposite, right? If you want, and paradoxically, the oldest of the Rus tradition versus the autocratic Mongol model that fundamentally had been the Muscovite one at that point. But let's say, what I mean is that these middle classes didn't make the next step to become, let's say, a state on their own, right? There was always a mediation with the princes. So probably also this continuous balance was not resolved. However, it's also possible that the balance was already in favor of the princes, and that even in their case, they didn't bring their rule to the extreme consequences. When the Mongols arrived, Russia was, in this sense, rich, but politically divided, and so the best target, and it was taken over in a way that is also, as it's witnessed, by even the defeats of the German Poles in Poland and the Hungarians, was embarrassingly easy. Right, the Mongols arrived, and of course it's not that there wasn't an effort or a commitment, but that's exactly the point, right? They completely took over the whole thing, and it was brutal, right, to say the least. We know what happened during these raids, during these devastations, during the sacks, the pillaging, all the most radical violence that you can imagine under any point of view. People systematically killed, enslaved, raped, and so basically this was the again, one of the most from a European perspective, especially the Russian one, of the most nonsensically traumatic and incomprehensible of the greatest disgraces that naturally had to come for Christians, through the fact that these people had committed some grave sin for deserving such the sheer such scale in the violence of punishment that was clamorous, to say the least. And so this took all different forms. Let's say these are things you can find even on other occasions in Eastern Europe or in the Balkans, for example, at the time of the Ottoman conquest. I mean, the idea that national identity was defined at some point by some sort of martyrdom, right? Some fight against the forces of evil that brought the entire people to stand to the death, right? Fundamentally, almost without hope. And so that this sense of sacrifice, of blood, it's something that recurs prepotently, not in fact just in Orthodox art, but also, I don't know, even Catholic Poland shows this distinctly. There is probably a dark, a very dark psychological mindset that I presume does stem from what we don't quite realize very much too much in Western Europe as one of the single most traumatic events in the history of mankind, that there was such thing like the Mongol conquest in the first place. And so it shouldn't also be underestimated the structural impact that historically such events had, even on infrastructurally in these countries, right? And it is true that already at the time there weren't as developed as the West, but let's say a big deal of resources, of infrastructure and sources in the first place were destroyed in the process, right? If you look at, the great Russian cathedrals in the 12th century, there were, you understand there was a civilization, there was something that had grown and it would have taken a step forward, and that instead was completely wiped out, or at least radically transformed at the root in after the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion in Russia especially triggered the most ruthless rise of autocracy, of privatization, of principalization of Russia. That is to say, the majority of the people were the greatest good in this sense, were fundamentally destroyed socioeconomically. The aristocrats at that point were dramatically advantaged, and the Mongols used them to control better the areas of pushing the lower classes ever down. And so this is, again, something that we have witnessed in other areas, like we talk about the Central European monarchies and observing how, yes, they were, that they failed essentially to create something like a modern central state historically, and so with all the dramatic deficit in democracy and modernity that affected them up to still arguably still to this day. And so but for Eastern Europe specifically, this was far worse, right? So that you can even see in this regard an abyss still between Russia and that whatever lays west, right, culturally speaking. And indeed, what you see after the Mongol conquest is Russians as Mongol vassals, Russian armies as a pure identical copy of Mongol armies, because there is not even a single difference. Perhaps a greater quota of woodsmen, like kind of peasant militias from the forest areas, right, where the Mongols wouldn't venture because also their cavalry wasn't suited very much to, and of course they were less strategically relevant and even properly as targets. But for the rest, and we've seen this, we made videos about the Muscovite cavalry, we talked about Russian tactics at the time. We know that at that point, there is factually no scientific difference between a Russian army and a Mongol army in everything, right? And we've been tricked in part by the fact that Russian iconography was very conservative in nature, so it kept. I'm not aware of significant changes, let's say, pre-post-Mongol era icon making, right, artistic differences, but let's say what you see in these icons is like still the old Byzantine, classical, Roman, Greek-like models in armor that were, of course, like already anachronistic in a poetic license, artistic license, let's say. And that keep going on in Russian times. So people assume, so kind of the Russians maintained that thing. Then you go look at our actual archaeology at arms and armor, and you realize that things in material culture and hardware were properly at that point something else, and they were pretty damn Mongol, right? And so it's what we were saying before. It's part of that kind of denial that the trauma had brought, the idea that still there was the only true glue of Russia, in that, historically speaking, had been religion, right? And properly the Orthodox Christianity, and that wasn't just a religious model, but an imperial model, right? Also an autocratic model already at that point for the Russian princes, evidently, brought by the Caesar-Papistic one of Constantinople, which would be quite useful. In fact, also in the videos that we made about, in fact, late medieval Russia, we have seen how basically the majority of Russian leadership legitimization gravitated around who controlled the Patriarchy of Russia, right? So the thing of Kiev, Vladimir, Moscow, we made, I think the one title I used exactly this reference, reflect, let's say, what was the struggle for what was seen as the in fact, or at the time, the ruler of all the Rus, that initially was a Kievan prerogative as the most powerful center, eventually shifted to these other centers in post-Mongol times, were naturally something quite different. And as we were saying before, the rise of Moscow, that was, a minor Russian center up to the Mongol conquest, right? Is due to the fact that also it's not just geographic proximity; it's properly the fact that they had been nurtured politically as the medium for ruling over Russia by the Golden Horde, right? Later on, this is another story. But let's say the ferocity that we find in Russian autocracy, informed properly of an aristocracy that doesn't even quite conceive anything else behind itself, beyond itself. Is that what we see with the serfdom up to the 19th century actually lays its roots exactly in this phase, right? Because you can remain shocked by the quasi-racial racial discrimination that, the Polish Szlachta had towards its own peasants, in ways that the violence of which is unspeakable by any Western European standard that feudalism ever had, and that already historically is quite meaningful. But nothing compares with what Russia was up to that point. It was something appalling, and so it was mirrored eventually by still so much of what we have witnessed in the last 2 centuries, because I don't think even in there that the Soviet Union and its utter contempt for any kind of dignity of any essence of humanity didn't have anything to do with this. So what happened to Russia was something big, right? I'm stressing so much this aspect because I can make it even darker than this easily just by going into the details with what happened there. But the question is that it shocked the whole Christendom, right? There were, I don't know about movements, like probably there were also many Russian refugees at this point in various areas, let's say. Just later on, Russian historiography remembered in the annals of Novgorod, in fact, those had kind of escaped most of the onslaught, given that they were in the northernmost of Russia, to find the Mongols, this terrible men, of whom they didn't even know the language and the origin, and that appeared as animals rather than human beings, right? So a punishment of God for the sins of humanity entire. And this is a big deal because, again, in a Christian perspective, you also have to make sense of who these people are in the order of the world, right? And literally, who are these people, concretely? This is the time in which the myth of Gog and Magog came back. By the way, it's interesting that in the Gog is, if you read in the Bible, Gog is actually a person, and Magog the people in which it rules, right? So, in the Orthodox tradition, this was reported in a philologically correct way. In the West, instead, Gog and Magog were kind of 2 different peoples that had, emerged mysteriously, according to these Christian legends, as the heralds of the Antichrist, which was valid also for the Orthodox Christians at this point, witnessing what was happening there. Consider the thing went beyond. Even the Byzantine connection is important because the Mongols also invaded the Balkans. They swarmed also in the Middle East, so they were close, right? They were closer than what we used to think. Like, at least as Westerners, we often become very narrow-minded and we think, okay, well, what is Constantinople? It's the East, it's the exotic. No, it's just our home, right? So it's just next door, and so that's how close they went. And still, also there were, as you know, we talked about this too, a big deal of contacts that the same Mongol invasions favored, just by in a positive sense, by opening the Silk Road and all these things, and lots of Europeans going up to China and documenting the Mongols and kind of trying to interact with them positively and so on for their own interest. So it's this thing was recognized, right? Also in the in the Crusade, for example, that was not eventually launched from the Holy Roman Empire, but was this idea. We know that in other countries, like in Cyprus, in Spain, etc., it was registered as a sort of victory, just because eventually the Mongols had retreated, which had nothing to do with that, as far as we understand. But that's how far the concern for these people had arrived, right? Because of the Mongol invasion. In the spring of 1241, the horsemen of Batu Khan, having taken over that territory between Volga and the Black Sea that would have been the nucleus of the Khanate of the Golden Horde, in fact, reversed themselves eventually in Poland, on Bohemia, and on Hungary. And the flower of Christian knighthood couldn't stand the onslaught of these swarms that had a fame of absolute cruelty, and that combined a discipline and a strategical ability that had nothing short of exceptional, right? At Lenitz, even the Teutonic Knights, so the best that the West had at that point, were cut to pieces, quite literally. And in this picture, at Moi, the Hungarians were defeated. In the same way, the plot is a bit similar, right? The Mongols simply advanced, mostly razing to the ground, not stopping to besiege, right? That's what they did in Russia, the main cities, etc. But in the westernmost path, they mostly observed, right? And that's, again, as I was saying before, the proof that they didn't have like an aim of conquest at that point, at least in those areas. And so one could explain also how did this happen. Like, this is an important question in terms of military culture. Can we trace like an absolute superiority event of some kind of Mongol military culture capacity that was, at this point incapable, right, for the Westerners? This is an interesting question. The main problem, as always, is political, right? We don't have to think that the Mongols were unstoppable or undefeatable, right? And what we witness actually with Europe is quite likely the fact that the Mongols realized that they wouldn't make a headway that easily as they, wished at least they could have done. Europe was likely an important objective. Had the Mongols had the capacity or the possibility to subdue it in some ways. The point again is how to achieve that. Lenitsa, Mohi are all proofs, of course, of an important Mongol superiority over Western warfare of the time, but they are also single battles, right? We can't just absolutize a political military capacity on the base of a tactical outcome. Surely there was a lot of quality involved, and surely the tactics employed, the maneuvers that the Mongols were capable of carrying out. We'll make videos about this, opening the wings, opening the center into wings, refusing the posterior lines, and so attracting Western heavy cavalry that was in fact all about breaking through into this trap, right, by eventually enveloping, right, counterattacking, enveloping with the wings and so on, and cutting to pieces was a brilliant maneuver. Western tactics at the time objectively didn't have anything similar to offer, but also we don't have to underestimate in this sense the fact that in order to cope with them, the Mongols were to recur to this kind of tactics. So the best that the West could achieve in that sense was not taken by the Mongols lightly. They knew that Western cavalry was pretty tough. They realized coming to this place it was probably quite an interesting for them, because they realized that maybe Russia, Poland, Hungary weren't, as you were saying before, the most developed or populated, or even, we can say even military consistent. It depends, right? This is debatable, but in general, everything was mostly concentrated in terms of moral material resources in the West, right? The big poles here, we're talking mostly England, France, Italy. That's where the real strengths were being pioneered, also in military capacity, military technology, and so on. The same Germany, half of it probably there showed something in some capacity. There were some detachments that were cut down along the way. The Bavarians managed to do that. The Bohemians were kind of confident about. I mean, they were freaking out, but they wouldn't face the Mongols in battle because they knew that they reinforced their cities, their strongholds, and they realized that that they would have not given battle. In fact, what puzzled the Europeans was mostly about the Mongol strategic mobility, but as we have seen at that point, the Mongols didn't use that to score a specific blow by taking one big cities in Central Europe or doing anything in that kind. So they had probably very likely outstretched their supply lines, their logistical chain, and they realized that the local political and social background was providing just lots of these, individually strong knightly elements that altogether could even represent a threat, maybe in a pitched battle, but that mostly would procure a lot of problems in the case of a territorial occupation, because especially of the level of encapsulation that naturally was increasing the more they went westward. So they realized that it wasn't easy, right? There were important barriers, at least in some ways. We don't know whether they properly, they crossed the Danube. At some point they showed, of course, their logistical capacities, their engineering capacities as well. But we know probably in Germany they stopped to the Elbe. Even in Bohemia they didn't push very much further. They had just to, even in there, to pass to reconnect with the with the other, because it was a coordinate maneuver, the one between Poland and Hungary, right? So they rejoined forces eventually later. So we don't exactly know what they were doing. We don't have enough sources to assess that. I mean, we realized what the whole thing was. It was a sort of a reconnaissance aimed at, of course, exploiting any situation that would seem, reasonable, profitable enough, right? But eventually they stopped, also because, again, they were called back by this major political event that made them abort the whole thing, one or another. So we don't know what would have happened, right? We know that at that point, as we were saying before, the papacy and the empire were putting together an expedition, and that nothing was done because the Mongols retreated earlier than that. In any case, because also we don't know how many they were, right? For example, the contingent that crossed into Silesia and Moravia were not a dramatically large force, right? They were part of the force that had fought at Legnica for sure. They were perhaps something around 8,000. So it's not just like an invasion force on a large scale thing. So also, what happened in Hungary was mixed by the fact that the Mongols had been triggered because at least they accused the Hungarian kings of having supported the Kumans. So it wasn't just like okay, we're coming just to systematically subjugate you because we want to take over the whole continent, or at least larger parts than the ones that eventually they already in that westernmost situation they showed they could have pushed forward, but at their risk and still with, probably not all the backups and the necessity of such a large-scale project. There are some. We mostly rely on Western chronicles in here, and we don't get very much reliable information. We know of the. We know that the danger appeared as extreme. Right, Frederick II, as we were saying before, appealed to the princes of Christendom, inviting them to unite to him in a crusade that would have been also quite important for him for political reasons, given that he was excommunicated at the time. So this would have brought him the prestige of universal ruler in this what seemed like an apocalyptical cosmic clash between these monsters coming from nowhere. In fact, the purpose, as I said, was to throw back the Tartars in the Tartars, right? And this happened under Gregory IX. Then also Innocent IV, who succeeded him, seemed inclined to the same solution. There were different negotiates between the emperor and the papacy at this point. The first one failed, and there were other calls a long time. But at the end of the day, the crusade against the Mongols didn't happen. Exactly because Batu Khan had to withdraw himself, right? So most of these areas were not occupied. Indeed, the Mongols suffered an important number of losses, right? Just by attrition, and in general, just even these, the Western Knights weren't there just to be, killed without spilling blood, right? So, doesn't matter how collectively untrained compared to the Mongols they were in a sense, but still they weren't literally the easiest enemy to take out, and indeed, logistics there probably played a very important role, right? They didn't really have a real base on which they could replenish, right? Their armies were big. At the point, as we've seen, they exhausted most of the local resources. The best place to organize an invasion of Europe would have probably been in the Pannonian Plain, but even in there, the Hungarians realized as other peoples that even though their armies had been crushed in open field, that their strongholds had remained intact, right? So a Mongol army that fundamentally spends winter in central Hungary, but surrounded all by hostile fortresses with no connection, like you have to go back across the Carpathians to reach what eventually Russia, and then the other supply lines are other logistical centers are more far away. So that's a problem, right? And so you can't quite operate in this situation. And yet the most important factor here is not that the Mongols were properly knocked out by these factors alone, or at least we don't have measure to know that, is that Ögödei had died, and so again the Mongol chieftains were called back to Karakorum for the Qara-Khitai. And here the possibilities of resuming at least the European campaign kind of stopped, because the next great Khan was Guyuk in 1241-1248, who launched messages like surrender, subject to the Oceanic ruler, and so on, but eventually no European campaign was resumed. And after him, this is important, the Mongols actually mutated route and policy. They didn't point anymore on Europe and the Mediterranean, but on China, which made, in my opinion, a lot of sense, right? In that situation, when, especially in 1279, the Song dynasty crumbled, definitely, and on its throne rose, for the first time after millennia, a non-Chinese, the Great Khan Kubilai. And so what is remembered in Chinese history as the foreign dynasty, in fact the Yuan, began at the time. More of this later, meaning that the Yuan dynasty is important, is, let's say, the first dynasty that managed to rule all over China in its territorial entirety after the Han dynasty. So it's an important accomplishment. But as we will see, the Mongols for a while would try still to be separated, or at least to maintain China, and that also the empire would gradually fragment, and so China was seen as mostly as something isolated on its own from the other Mongol possessions, from the same Mongolian away, and it was kind of a jewel, and an appallingly large and rich system, and so on. It's kind of obvious that the Mongols, even if, because of their location, would eventually opt for the most, for the closest, most advantageous pool of resources, and this major, river, major valleys, dramatically populated, but millenary civilization, and around which they had gravitated, as we've seen, properly as auxiliaries, also properly in the political and military culture, and had already tested kind of the softness and the possibility of breaking through and taking over the same system. So, as you understand here, even if we were assuming that just geography here counted anything, and we know that geopolitics fundamentally does not exist, Europe was from the other side of Eurasia. So this would have brought, even properly for the center of Mongol powers, more problems than basically any other place to cross. You can argue here, I know that probably a better video would be suited than this, because this just tries to resume the events, but there should be a quite thorough analysis here of the thing. Is also looking at the consistency of what the Mongols had up to that point, met with in terms of civilization or resistance, properly of moral and material dynamics that were interplaying. Europe at that time was booming, right? And it was quite diverse and quite, well, quite competitive already within itself, right? You can imagine against, an external enemy who could coalesce it in a way or another. The Chinese were something different for reasons that now are maybe too unnecessary to recall, but let's say by this time China was truly possibly the most advanced country in the world. It's difficult to draw parallelisms and comparisons. In my opinion, at this point, Europe had kind of mostly equated Chinese capacities and power. It is true that in the previous centuries, China had the upper hand, but let's say China was probably already undergoing that phase of, sclerotization that we kind of attribute most of its eventual collapse to by the 19th century, so fundamentally, much later, 600 years after that. But let's say, such a big movement, such a big dynamic, surely, didn't begin the century before, right? We often compare by quantity, not by quality, right? The fact that you can still, easily, by the 18th century, China was the strongest military power on earth. There's no doubt about this, right? And the reason why we can say that is objectively that the military force they could mobilize was enormous, and its civilization was surely, quite active and dynamic in its entirety. But, when we're talking about properly the political and social balance, and we analyze, as we've seen, also the Mongols, as we've seen, had been actually influenced by this. I mean, the idea that there is just one sole divine ruler that has to fundamentally, control the whole system, that will have the means to do it, where the masses of the peasants will fundamentally be brought ever more under, and there is no real, dynamism beyond that, and the whole mindset is framed under the idea of a perfect order that doesn't have to be thought as changing, because it can never change, as it is perfect. And if it weren't perfect, it wouldn't be divine, so the whole system would have to be discussed. Well, this brings to to an attitude that, of course, by 13th century China, we can't say, China had lost its kind of, moral strength or material capacity, so that their armies were just, nothing and so on. But let's say just the fact that the Mongols at that point managed to take this system over is quite meaningful from the standpoint that the Mongols were not really a particularly developed people in the first place. So surely they were provided with this dramatic moral force that they had matured to a very, intense, let's say, military testing. Let's say that the Mongol Empire, in fact, proved and kept kind of fueling on the long run, but still without a much else of another civilizational base on which eventually to keep the system together, for example, or not to be absorbed eventually by the local, this much older and stronger cultural influences of the places they conquered, right? So if we were to compare China and Europe by the 13th century, we would surely see that, especially in hardware, we're talking about two systems that probably equate each other. If not, China is probably still superior. But in moral terms and in the capacity here of mobilizing those material forces through will, through a vision of the world, through the aptness to an autonomistic thinking. This idea wasn't quite in China as much as it was in Europe. This may be a reason. The reason still distances are dramatically important as well. So I don't absolutely doubt that the Mongols, if they had stayed just not in, I don't know, in fact, south of the Baikal Lake, but I don't know, north of the Caspian Sea, let's put it in this way, would have had in the same environment, let's say also politically and socially, would have likely subjugated Europe, and most of it, and probably they would have easily managed to bring it down and exercise some form of control, and probably they would have even imposed up some sort of greater force on it, culturally speaking, that they were able to do on China, right? These are all debatable things. We're really talking about by fantastic fantasy history, let's say, but at the same time, in my opinion, it's important to recognize this aspect. And also, as a military historian, I must say this, that as you know, I'm not a particular fan of exoticism. I think that I don't have really anything against other cultures. As you know, I believe that cultures are just the product of a situation, and you can't really blame cultures because, I don't know, one developed, more or less than another, because, there were certain situations that didn't, certain factors kind of didn't allow them, or at least certain combinations, when, of course, it's always kind of your fault at some point, or at least the measure of your capacity is reflected by the same limits of your culture. So in a way, there's no excuse. There's not a kind of gnostic discorporation between what you can do and what you think like in practice. But and that's why it's important also to observe the Mongol takeover of China in that regard from the Chinese perspective. But the idea is that we often, I think as Westerners, not much overestimate the East, but actually overlook the West. That's the actual mechanics that we do. And so we don't see what, from our rightly critical attitude towards ourselves, that however doesn't seem to be, critical in a neutral sense, but rather in saying, trying to bring each other down, right? Which in some way may even be a spring for some other kind of improvement in some ways, but in a comprehensive system, in a unitary direction especially, this is not useful, right? Or at least it should be paralleled by some form of objectivity also on the actual capacities. And as far as I've been analyzing about military history of Asia, and I admit I don't know more than much about that. I started as you know, a series about Chinese warfare, and I'm still at the very beginning. And I did give a look to Mongol warfare over time, and my idea is that this system was not, as always, as a Clausewitzian, I will tell you, it was their force was political, before military, right? You can't have a military success if you don't have a drive, right? And so you can't have the same identical Mongol army, but in the shoes of somebody else completely failing at every level, right? Instead, the historical one scoring the spectacular success that it did, right? But at the same time, this success has to be measured on the context, and I'm skeptical about the consistency of most, in fact, of the of the solidity of most of the cultures that, in terms of moral, strength and capacity, and also probably also material means at some point. Like some countries were smaller, or at least they controlled areas that were not particularly developed, or maybe they were quite rich but they didn't have particularly an amount of manpower or militarized manpower. This is especially the case of Central Asia, properly met, like especially from the western side. And so we have to accept the fact that even between China and Europe, let's say, there is not really much else as we intended, right? Even Islam is at the time was, first of all, at this point that the great plans of the caliphate had died. Kind of Islam was still part of one of the victims of the Mongols. I mean, the fact that Baghdad was razed to the ground, it equates as a sheer tragedy in the history of mankind, as if the Mongols had razed Rome to the ground, right? So at that point, symbols also are important, right? That could have not happened if you look at the Islam for what it was. It was essentially at that point a disconnected system of different states that didn't have much of a unity or a possibility of, or even a remote possibility of reunifying the whole thing. You could argue that Europe was similar, at least in the failure that was starting properly at that point of the whole Roman Empire specifically. But we still have very powerful forces like France that were rising in the same papacy from a spiritual point of view, that had possibilities of hegemonizing the whole system, at least its more productive areas. And therefore comparing in a way, and you understand how proportionally greater the moral force, even just of a country like France, was in the capacity of hegemonizing the whole system. Kind of, they failed, but they almost succeeded, like as the Germans had done basically 2 generations before. And let's say of being propositively even active against the possibility of Mongol invasion, than what China eventually managed to score from what should have, in theory, at least been a more unitary, statal, monarchic, kind of properly imperial and imperialistic and universal and universalistic tradition, as it should have been. And of course, it was a different system. It wasn't a perfect one, but exactly because of this, we can measure its kind of consistency. So what I'm saying at the end of the day, that there wasn't anything kind of more resistant in terms, strictly speaking, of let's say cultural, civilizational, than Europe and China at that point. Yes, at some point, for example, the Mongols were stopped also by the Mamluks, by Egypt, right? And that also happened at the limits of their logistical capacities, probably the same way it happened with Europe. So in my opinion, with Europe, it would have not succeeded. The Mongols would have not ventured into that, or at least even if they had tried, probably they would have immediately understood it would have been a bad mistake, because all factors combined doesn't seem to me that there was any chance for a systematic subjugation of Europe, and especially its maintenance on it, especially properly in the moment in which the continent was at the peak of its rise, right? Medieval civilization fundamentally was booming at that point and becoming ever more substantiated and structured. You know that I'm also anti-technologistic in nature, but there is a chronology, I don't remember which source actually this is, but it was talking about the German preparation for the anti-Mongol crusade that included some type of gear, including pavizes and crossbows, for example, the Zetzschild, and some crossbows that were seen, at least because we know this from the European perspective, as something that the Mongols apparently feared. This is quite interesting for a reason, because it's just a detail. And you know that you don't win wars, we just said it's political, you don't win wars with technology, as most people, I would say naively, but childishly is better, suited as an adverb, believe. But in a world that was, somewhat materially homogeneous, like that one, you think the Mongols arriving, having the face of a, the Star Wars empires in terms of technology or, capacity or superiority, not really, right? To the eyes of the Europeans, these were just nomadic barbarians, right? And even if, of course, they brought with them some sort of grandeur and, prestige and fear, and especially this, in fact, extreme ferocity that was part of their own regular mean of subjugation, deterrence, which, again, is important as long as deterrence is important as long as you have a military force that you can use properly to face against other military force, right? If the idea is that your deterrence is also importantly founded on cruelty, and there are many examples of this, because literally there is a divide between West and East. Eastern cultures really do have, and did have, especially at the time, with the Mongols, a much more normalized taste for violence, for torture, right? For ferocity and gratuitous violence to be exercised. Is this because they were more evil, like something? I don't think so. I mean, I think that, of course, if you really look at also what they believed, what they said, etc., they were factually, as we were saying before, we cannot disconnect the two things, but the point is that there was a pragmatic reason, that is to say, this was much more autocratic. That is to say, this was a consequence of a system that was much less functional in a civil sense, meaning that properly the capacity of state building lacked more. So just as in Europe before we had states and we were tribes, of course we were much more evil and ferocious and violence focused and terrifyingly brutal in that regard, because how do you bring order in a system that is so kind of floating? And so we cannot argue that, doesn't matter how powerful the Mongol Empire was, it still was founded on these nomadic populations living in the wild. Right, and so from their point of view, like, how can you control eventually other countries or other systems, especially the ones that are not even so, even particularly steadily fit, right? If not by sheer violence, so something that you would try to impress them with, but in the lack of any other civil tool. This is important because in China, for example, the Mongols behaved fairly well. Like, the Yuan dynasty was kind of making the Chinese, trying at least to make the Chinese forget that they were Mongols. Because of course China was a much more civilized place, right? Whereas if you have to conquer, I don't know, the Khwarezmian Empire, well, chances are, or the same, certain tribal reality, you can argue even Persia by a certain degree, especially in the areas that were more feudalized in nature, well, that those were still kind of wilder systems where you would enact a much more radically brutal, degree of distraction, and this also happens where you objectively can't rule, when you can't found a permanent rule, and everything is going to remain always unstable. There is also so again, as we were saying before, the Mongols understood that it was more profitable to rule over civilized places rather than pastures. So if you raise to the ground civilized places, you can have pastures, but not as profitable as having civilized places under your control. There is also a process of civilization of the Mongols, meaning that initially, even though their choices strategically were always very, very, very correct, like very logical and rational, they probably had more of a taste, or they were at least more inclined and proclivious to violence than they would become later, right? Also because they eventually settled in the same places that they had to rule, so they understood that it wasn't very convenient, in fact, for them to destroy them in the first place. So looking even at their, outlook, like, the peoples in Europe who were defeated were the Russians, the Poles, plus some Germans in that case, the Teutonic Order, but not quite an entire Teutonic army, let's say, in a large sense. It was mostly armies of coalition, as mostly Europeans fought like, and the Hungarians, right? So these peoples weren't particular, like, all peoples at the time had some consistent capacity, militarily wise, right? There is no point to that, right? Surely these powers were, as we've seen, kind of slightly more, let's say, especially the Eastern, you go more disarticulated in a subtle sense than others. The Poles at this point are basically a bunch of duchies kept together, even in there, by this kind of dynastic uniformity, let's say, commonality, right, of the PS themselves. The Hungarians do have an important power, and they're, at this point, they're almost completely fully feudalized in a sense. Their process of westernization is almost complete, right? And they have an important power that controls all of the surrounding populations from the Hungarian plain and so on. It's difficult to say that they weren't a strong power. That they actually were, right? They just weren't, maybe, they couldn't compare historically at this point by scale, at least by, what the goal, especially thinking about the 12th century, right? But the 12th century, Germany, the Byzantine Empire, were still evidently a bigger, more powerful system than Hungary in itself. So they weren't really the top European power, but let's say they were also, a relevant power, consistent power by that point. And yet the Mongols managed to crush all these peoples either in sieges or in pitched battles, and that's meaningful. This striking series of victories is no coincidence. There was evidently something systemic in it as an explanation, but which is obviously, a Mongol superiority over the West, the Western armies at least. However, the Western you went, right, the tougher the military systems you would find would become, right? And so also the more complicated logistically would have been to fight there in the first place. And there is this passage in the Chronicles, in a source, and I remember that it says about Frederick II, planning, to use the crossbow against the Mongols, because that was a very effective weapon against them that the Mongols feared in a certain sense. Now, if you look at you see, the West managed to defeat the steppe completely by the mid-16th century, right? By the mid-16th century, pike and shot, Timofeyevich, the Russian Pizarro who took over Siberia, basically presented the nomadic peoples of the steppes with this insolvable tactical problem of pike and shot that basically cut down everything that those nomadic peoples had. But even before that, the crossbow seems to have had a similar, capacity, at least, by lesser degree of gunpowder, but let's say that was being functionalized against the peoples of the steppe in many contexts. Saying, especially, this was typical, in fact, of all the Slavic, let's say, this crescent that goes from, let's say, southwest to northeast, from the Balkans to Russia, that fundamentally bordered the steppe. And so all this area, I have the impression through some archaeological find, some kind of typology of troops that pops out, and some even earlier features that had developed kind of system that was effective enough, especially with its infantries, to cope with the cavalries of the steppes, mainly with an important protection, certain types of shields, etc., that were evidently functionalized to, even kind of a defensive mode, but still with a greater surface, in fact, of protection, right, in the front, and backed by an important missile power from the rear. And so crossbows were, especially by the 13th century, spreading importantly in this sense, and they were mostly an anti-cavalry weapon, given that horses were by that time largely unarmored, and so doesn't matter about the protection, but was a hell of a horse killer. And when you see these areas like Germany, Italy, but even you could find these things even surprisingly in wilder areas, right? You know that the Pavis, for example, was developed in Lithuania earlier than in Italy, apparently, even though the one that really took over Europe was the one of Italian origin. But let's say it's no surprise that by the 13th century, the Lithuanians that were witnessing the collapse of the Russians at next door, and that also profited dramatically by entering Russia and kind of sharing power with the Mongols in Ruthenia and so on, provided themselves with some kind of, more protective shields in a type of warfare that had, naturally, with the injection of a steppe people, intensified dramatically the volume of arrow fire, for example. And that could be also anti-cavalry in nature, right? If you look at the maximization of infantry capacity during medieval times, of the great medieval civilization, fundamentally these are the Italian armies between the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century. We're talking about masses of tens of thousands of literal pikemen. There's a very, and with even some offensive capability. They weren't that far from the Swiss of the mid-15th century. Eventually they faded shortly afterwards, so the thing didn't develop further, but they had reached a dramatic capacity. And thousands, that same, supporting those infantry wings, cavalry at the center, crossbowmen, that we know from those accounts basically had a dramatic anti-cavalry capacity. So Frederick II, ruling from Sicily, Holy Roman Emperor, preparing a crusade against the Mongols in Germany, where they thought they would have hit at that point, and being formally also fighting against the Lombard League, having many Italians also from inside, would have deployed much of, the best hardware, kind of, even providing troops also from certain contexts, etc. Germany having a very, a very good cavalry. At that point, almost practically reaching the French in quality, at least by the mid-13th century, that there was an accomplished fact, say that probably, that system combined we have never seen in action, right? It's true that operating in Central Europe is not like just operating in France or Italy, that's true. You have also lots of other peoples that are still somewhat something else, right? I don't know if you think about the same German infantries or Bohemian infantry, they weren't, some of southwestern Germany were good already at that point. There were battles in the 13th century. Think about Boringen at the end of the century itself, but they weren't like, they were peasants, commoners, without any kind of professional soldiery, regimentation, like, I don't know, the Italian communal militias and so on. They, in any case, they might have diluted a little bit in this Central European kind of warfare, more in favor of heavy cavalry, and so this almost, but in my opinion, still legitimate, stubborn, and obvious necessity of charging straight ahead, because that's what heavy cavalry, that's what Western cavalry was about. It was pretty damn effective, as we were saying before. It's not that there were many other options. I'm always triggered furiously every time I read of people say, look, during the 100 Years' War under the against the Ottomans, etc., like this stupid Western heavy cavalry always charged straight. But what do you think? Like, do you think that those who fought against that were just saying, stupid damn, they charged straight ahead, we can't kill them all? There are, let's say, some things, I wouldn't say few things, but you would think of it probably that would traumatize you for the rest of your life, like standing in front of not even a real cavalry charge, but a fake cavalry charge. And we know this because we have tried with actual modern military to just stand aligned in front of a fake cavalry charge and see what happened, right? So Western armies weren't, in this sense, primitive or backwards, or the Mongols weren't bringing in any kind of, millenary strategic wisdom that was to take over this. They were a dramatically developed and very well experienced and tested military system, endowed with a dramatic moral force and incredible collective training and the resources to fuel it up. And so the West didn't have, let's say, even a unitary framework, politically speaking, in that sense. So they couldn't field anything that had, especially in terms of collective training or large-scale armies, the same level of quality. There is no doubt, right? So that's the actual difference. It's not about the, let's say, the technological or the geniality of tactics or anything like that. Let's say, the Mongols had a standard pack of tactical formula that was meant to take over any army in the world. It wasn't like that, right? And probably, I think already at that point, if we had seen probably a very well-built Western army finally, put together with some of the best elements of, say, the Empire, France, something like that, probably, surely aided by the Mongol logistical difficulties, all these, the dramatically fortified European landscape, etc., we would have seen probably at some point a European victory over a Mongol army. I'm pretty sure of that. And I think that especially this fear, the anecdote about the Mongol fear of crossbows, to me is crucial, because it is true in the sense that other steppes peoples feared crossbow in the same way. So it doesn't seem to me that there was something particularly different, right, than that. And some say, no, because the rate of fire they had at bows doesn't mean anything, right? Sedentary armies with crossbows and basically no archer were able to defeat countless times steppe peoples with bows. The rate of fire is bullshit, right? It's like when you say that for the 100 Years' War and the longbow versus crossbow. It has nothing to do with that. First of all, there is no way to measure that in how that impacted as a factor in the system of the battle. There is no way to scientifically or historically measure that. And secondly, we know in many other contexts it simply doesn't count anything, because we know that in these engagements there are dramatically larger forces that intervene that have nothing to do with the rate of fire, all these things. Those things can make the difference on a base that has to be cohesive, right? If that base is not cohesive, as it often is not, because it always swings, goes up and down, you can't quite measure anything. And so that's why you have to stay open, kind of try to understand what is going on. So that idea that even such a dramatically developed people like the Mongol ones that were already getting Sinicized and having even explosives, I mean things that were pretty ahead in military technology they took mostly from China, but they already knew actually through Chinese contacts or before that had those dramatic siege capabilities, etc. To be scared by something like a crossbow, it's maybe that was a European boutade in that source. Can't be, but the fact that we know, actually studied, because I was studying for my research, that Frederick II put together something similar to pavises and crossbows, actually tells a lot about the fact that an important part of Mongol force, of course, was based on this arrow showering. That was the obvious, like, all steppes peoples, the core was heavy cavalry, but it was just a minority element. The rest was light cavalry. And in fact that this against the Westerners, Mongol tactics would mostly kind of lure them in, and so refusing the center, etc. It doesn't speak for, again, the magic movement that would defeat the enemy. It's still an incredibly difficult and dangerous and risky maneuver that you have to enact when you know that fundamentally you don't have a solid enough center to withstand the blow of the enemy center. In this case of Western heavy cavalry. That's not an opinion. that because you see, warfare has some universal lines. It would have not been no advantage at that point if you had had a superior center that could overwhelm the enemy frontally, to not to use that, because the clash would have been hard, but still it would have annihilated the enemy immediately, because that's what it would have exhausted itself immediately against. Instead, what you have here is the necessity to envelope Western cavalry, because frontally speaking, that was a still pretty damn scary thing, even for the Mongols. And the Mongols really had seen a lot of stuff. Then all the considerations, as we were saying before, that, European weather was humid, and so the Mongols couldn't use bows. It's utter bullshit. First of all, they had means at the time to keep bowstrings dry that you don't even imagine. Secondly, these guys invaded and destroyed Russia in winter, right? Just this. They fought in Southeast Asia, in all climates that you can imagine, right? And there doesn't seem anywhere any proof that the Mongols had any problem related to that, and that you can, again, monofactorialize the causes of major political and strategical events just because this bow is kind of less powerful than, it doesn't work like that. Secondly, again, rain means heavy ground. For Western cavalry, that's pretty bad. And in this sense, again, the Mongols had mostly lighter cavalry in that sense, so they would have been advantaged. All other calculations, like, what weather was there in the 13th century, what the hell do you know, right? All this bullshit that it says, that we know for some kind of strange calculation that, I don't know, in Uri it rained, or there was a lot of rain. Yeah, what about, because what if, all the bad weather was concentrated in Uri, and at that point, at that time, what the hell do we know what was happening elsewhere? And why that would have not been just another average, year like any other. Just because you relativize something on the base of something minimal that you know, and that without knowing anything about the rest of the world system, just for you to publish garbage to pretend that you have found something that has no scientific value whatsoever, right? So no, I don't think that, and there may have been probably other reasons of other order that we don't see. Properly, but I mean, maybe the prestige even attached to conquering other lands that we don't understand because we're not 13th century Mongols anymore. Or simply what they thought, and maybe they were wrong about, maybe about saying Europe or about the Middle East, about other countries, we don't know. We do not know, especially we do not know what the Mongols thought, right? And we know that certain things the Europeans thought were not correct. But at the same time, we see so much activity, and at the end of the day, confidence in capacity, aside from terror, that we think that this was not a system that would have just stayed there, sitting ducks, being taken over, and just, because, the Mongols are too strong, man, you can't, this doesn't happen in military history. It's not historically an army that is something that you can't defeat. Nor tactically, and nor more obviously by scale, strategically or politically. So this, unfortunately, is something that we will never know, because I doubt we will ever find anything again from that time from the Mongol side. From the European side, maybe, but it's scarce, right? And so, aside from the Mongol contribution to destruction, just you can't quite pretend that, I don't know, early 13th century Poland or Hungary would produce more than much. Surely we know, however, that they tried. They tried at least to test what Europe was, and so they were interested in it, and obviously they had some ambition, and they were seeing that action as some important thing. And after all, the success in Russia and especially that was, again, something fairly different from Western Europe, is still very meaningful. Very, very meaningful about still the power of the Mongols, and equally the realization that the Westerners would have at least made something, right, to prevent that of an invasion of their land. So we were speaking about Kublai and the Yuan. So with Kublai, the Mongol imperial family and the Mongol aristocracy entire underwent a very rapid process of Sinization. We can say that, say, up to 1368, so that when basically the national dynasty of the Ming overthrew the Yuan, the Chinese Empire was not Mongolized. On the contrary, it was held by a Mongol dynasty. This, yes, but that, however, did its best to have its origins forgotten. In other ways, it was not possible to rule a country like China with the means of the steppe, right? So in all this, this Chinese emperor kept being the Great Khan, of course, and so at the same time, the head of the Mongol tribal empire that in the second half of the 13th century became, we can say, kind of a federal empire, which is another term for saying that basically the empire had started fragmenting. Like the Great Khan resided in Beijing, but to him, at least formally, looked as a superior authority the Khans of the Golden Horde. So those Mongols that had occupied the south of Russia, the Qara-Khitai. So as we've seen, this thing that existed between the Aral Lake, Tibet, and China, and also the Ilkhanate of Persia. In 1258, the Khan Hulagu had conquered Baghdad, as we were saying before. That was kind of the imposition of that was the collapse in many ways of Mesopotamia in a civilizational sense, given that the Ilkhanate namely ruled over Baghdad, but the area was always contended basically at that point between Egypt and Persia, and historically, as you know, there wouldn't be anything in between consistently as a national entity, right? It was always eventually the Ottomans and the Safavids and so on. And that is important because it gives you by scale how impacting and devastating the Mongol destructions could be. So to wipe out fundamentally what had been the heart of Islamic civilization and art and science and culture, and so one of the great cities in the history of mankind, it was literally wiped out. And so this again tells an important lot also on what probably the Mongols saw as a they understood the importance of their targets, the importance of the symbols that are represented, right? Sometimes we see there were barbarians and brutes that just destroyed these things, and so we lost so much in civilization because of that. Well, this is surely true. Like the average Mongol at the time wasn't surely a gentleman with great regard for such irrelevant concerns like human piety and and things like these. But let's say that the leaders were intelligent people, and of course whatever they did for a practical purpose, and sometimes, sadly enough, wars destroy, and sometimes it's not even the faults of those who destroy, which may seem odd, but if you occupy especially one place, or you refuse to surrender, there are some aspects of that come back in a very crude but still kind of sensible logic that war unfortunately makes us face in its greatest brutality, for sure. But still, I want to think that the Mongols had eventually some interest in Europe. Also, that from Mongol China, let's call it in this way, we don't know that much about the Europeans, say as much as compared to what actually the Europeans knew about China. This is an important difference between East and West that still happens. It began in the history of historiography. Western historiography is another thing, right? It has an extra gear. There's nothing to do with that. We documented China much better than China documented us, or at least for what we see, because again, unfortunately, we have this virus of autoimmune disease, let's say, of communism that wiped out basically all the entire Chinese historical back largely, like at least the sheer cultural civilizational damage brought by that in that country is something that we really would like to cry from morning to night. If you even grasp to imagine a tiny bit of the scale of what was done there during communism, but also we see at the time that, let's say, their historiography was still different, was still probably also much more self-referential in nature, and so whereas Europeans were open to the idea that there was something else, that they were not even, they wouldn't find it like a problem, and so even the Mongols were eventually understood, right? It's like when you read the Qara-Khitai, like you realize that only a Westerner could reason in that way already at that time, and that so this big scary thing that had happened, that was surely one, still was seen immediately by a civilization like the European one as actually a something they could profit from, something that we needed to know, we needed to create context with, we needed to scope in ways that probably these other peoples weren't quite keen on just for the sake of themselves. A Mongol would have done it for the sake of conquest in a very brutally pragmatic way. A Chinese would have not even properly cared. They would have cared as long as maybe there was some broader policy related to international trade or something, but in strictly cultural terms, they had China. They had the perfection of the divine ruler. What the hell? What else do we want to find? Right? In Europe, we had this struggle for investitures that taught us to quarrel, but in this sense, to negotiate and to develop a critical thinking and all a set of other qualities that I'm sure, even in relation with the Mongol invasion, would have probably made an important difference compared to other areas that were brought under the Kingizid Empire. In any case, for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.